Welcome back. This is the Ben Shapiro Show. Our number 855-236-3228, hanging out together through the coronavirus lockdown. Brooke in Kentucky, you're on the Ben Shapiro Show. Go for it, Brooke.
Hey, Ben. Good to speak to you. The governor in Kentucky has taken aggressive measures to limit the spread of COVID-19 in our state. That includes closing schools last week and then limiting bars and restaurants to only carry out and delivery last night. But recently there was a resident that tested positive for the virus, but he left against medical advice and refused to self-quarantine. So police are now stationed outside of his home to ensure that he doesn't leave to spread the virus. I just want to know, what's your take on this? Is this setting a dangerous precedent against personal liberties, ignoring due process in the Fifth Amendment? Is it a slippery slope, or are desperate measures called for in these desperate times?
So, Brooke, I do think that state and local authorities do have an enormous amount of power, and they always have, actually, in times of public crisis. And the question is whether it remains temporary or whether it becomes a permanent sort of thing. If it's a permanent sort of thing, you're talking about permanent violation of rights. If you're talking about a temporary thing, Abraham Lincoln suspended habeas corpus in wartime. Franklin Delano Roosevelt took measures that certainly violated civil liberties during wartime. So did Woodrow Wilson. Some of those were for good. Some of those were for bad. Some of those were over the top. Some of those were necessary. The question as to, somebody who's refusing to self-quarantine right now, who's been diagnosed with coronavirus, the governor, I'm sure, has authority under the state constitution to do what he is doing. If that lasts beyond, like, let's just say that the governor decided, I'm locking down everybody forever. Obviously, that would be a sort of a different story. During public health emergencies, localities and states have an enormous amount of authority. I spoke with former Attorney General Jeff Sessions yesterday on the show, and he said exactly the same thing. This has always been true. Once it starts to become permanent, we should always be zealous and guard our liberties. At the same time, we did give local and state government the ability to protect us from externalities. And when you're talking about the spread of a pandemic, that is a fairly significant externality. Brooke, really appreciate the call. And you're right. We should be vigilant about our liberties. At the same time, we got to balance in the need to protect ourselves in something like this situation. Linda in Roseville, California, you're on the Ben Shapiro Show. Go for it, Linda.
Yeah, hi, Ben. I've been listening to the news to try to hear something about how our military and their readiness is dealing with the coronavirus, and also how their families are doing.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't heard anything either, Linda. And honestly, I'd like to hear from some members of the military at 855-236-3228 to see how this is going. Obviously, military bases tend to be kind of close quarters. I would assume that the military is doing its best to space people out and ensure that there's social distancing. But frankly, I haven't heard anything either, Linda. And you're right, that is a hole in the media coverage. So I hope somebody will pick up your tip here and give us a little bit of information about how that's going. I know that, on the completely other side of the spectrum, America's prison system could be just an absolute hotbed for COVID-19. I mean, you're talking about people in close quarters, not particularly sanitary, cramped conditions, and not a lot of medical facilities. So there are a lot of questions to be asked about how exactly this thing gets controlled. Linda, really appreciate the call. Jeremy in Pennsylvania, you're on the Ben Shapiro Show. Go for it, Jeremy.
Hi, Ben. It's an honor to talk to you.
You bet. Go for it.
The question I have is that I've had some conflicting reports here. I typed in Wuhan back to work in Google search, and I've gotten all these news articles on here saying in China, life returning to normal as coronavirus outbreak contained. Do you feel as if the Chinese are actually on the other side of the curve, and if it's too soon to tell? Or is there any way that we could correlate that with our own response? I mean, our own response has to be almost as good as China's, if not better, to contain this, so that will give us some sort of a model going forward. I mean, they're more densely populated than we are. So, is there something there that we can hope for?
Jeremy, that is the big question, is how good is the information coming out of China? Now, I assume that Apple has been keeping tabs on the spread of coronavirus in China as well. And Apple just recently reopened their stores in China. They're still closed everywhere else. So that would be a good indicator, I would think, that China has actually gotten past it. But again, who the hell knows? And we also don't even really know what measures China took is sort of the problem here. I mean, China is a black box. And Beijing, for example, literally in the last few minutes, just expelled the American journalists from the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, VOA News, and Time from the Chinese mainland, Hong Kong, and Macau. So who the hell knows what they are doing behind the scenes? I mean, we really don't have any idea. I mean, it's the Chinese government. They have not been exactly shy in the use of physical force against people they disagree with. I mean, for all we know, they could have gone to the hospitals and done something terrible to people who are actually suffering from COVID-19, and now they're on the other side of it. So, it's hard to take a lot of inspiration from China. I'm hoping the question I have is whether South Korea is getting back to work, because they did a good job locking this down. But is the lockdown over there continuous, or are they getting back to work either? We just don't have enough information at this point, Jeremy. But agree with you. We need to see some evidence of somebody coming out of this thing before we start getting too optimistic.
And I have one more quick question, if that's okay.
Sure, go for it.
I just watched Trump talking the live coverage of another coronavirus update, and one of the reporters asked him, really without asking, if he was planning on a nationwide lockdown. I assume he meant by that martial law. And Trump really shied away from that, saying he didn't feel that was a good idea at all. Do you think where do you think the tipping point is for a nationwide lockdown?
Honestly, if we were talking about a disease that affected everybody of every age equally, and you're talking about 20% pandemic rates, then you would be talking about a nationwide lockdown. If, however, you are talking about protecting elderly people and you're talking about doing this for like a year, no, I don't think that's going to happen. I don't think anyone has any taste for a nationwide lockdown, nor, frankly, do I think that anybody has the resources to even enforce a nationwide lockdown of the sort that you've seen in Wuhan, China, for example. Alrighty, coming up, we are going to bring you more updates on COVID-19, everything COVID-19 related. The president held a press conference today. The federal government finally getting on top of this thing, trying to get its arms around it. But what conditions have to prevail in order for this to be successful? We'll talk about it. This is The Ben Shapiro Show.